And welcome to Co-op Guild. This is Steve. I'm here with a special guest. We got Bryan from Bad Crow Games. Hey, Bryan, how's it going?
Great. How's everyone doing today? Hope everyone's doing well.
Good, good. So, got to see lots of people here in our live chat. So, this is we try to do weekly. It doesn't always happen based on scheduling, but as much as we can, weekly live chat on various board game topics, generally with a cooperative focus. So, I see lots of friends here. See, Darren's here. We've got Pickle here. Yogi's here. Kim with the Gamma Slam on the boss battle. It's awesome. See Rudy. Welcome, Rudy. Nice to see you here. Also from Bad Crow Games, by the way. Matt is here. Jackie. Awesome. Lots of friends. Sweet. Okay. Hey, Frederick. Hey, Jan. Okay. So, what are we doing here today? So, it was last month in December. It was Barrett, Derek, and and we decided to sit around. We talked about the second editions of board games. It kind of what does that mean for us as the consumers and hobbies, and like what are some of the pros and cons against that? What are our impressions of it, type of thing. And it was very much consumer based, like because we're on the receiving end of this hobby. Like when I when I see a game pop up, do I wait until maybe the second time around because maybe there's gonna be fixes I can just get then, that type of idea. But that was, like I said, very much on the consumer side. Well, after that chat, Bryan's like, hey, by the way, I have some thoughts on that because you have been, and that's why you're on this show today, very involved with this Company of Heroes second edition. So you want to share a little bit about your involvement in that?
Sure. I mean, I don't know how deep we want to get into the weeds in the start, but I'll just start from the very beginning if that's all right. So, oddly enough, I was kind of just designing games on my own on the side, and I just happened to have played a little bit of Company of Heroes before their original Kickstarter. And I was interested. What interested me the most was kind of, I think it's the same thing when people view it now, is when they see World War II, I think it's very still an emotional thing for people. Like, when you get to war and kind of entering that modern war era, you're like, I don't know if this is for me. It's a war game. And oddly enough, I was at the same point at that juncture in my life. And I was like, well, I played a little bit of Company of Heroes. It was an enjoyable game. But what interested me the most was the semi-deterministic combat. So like I think the big thing that I had in particular, not only was the theme, was I think with a lot of war games, you get into it and you're like, is it just a dice chucker? Is there any real decision? Like obviously there's decision making, but does it matter? Because I think we don't have to go too far into it, but I think the industry kind of throws Euro games at people these days. And like, where's the mitigation? Where's the player agency? And so, I think for war games, everyone goes into it and is kind of afraid that it's like, yeah, are you making, what are you really doing in the game? Are you just spending many, many hours, like 8 hours a day? And like, are you actually making decisions? Are you just enacting are you playing like a historical representation? I think there's a lot of questions to it. So what interested me most again was that the economy,
Yeah,
like that Euro-based economy and the semi-deterministic combat. I'm like,
yeah,
this was like right up my alley, like because that's the thing. I had designed a game that was a little bit more abstract, a lighter weight kind of skirmish game. That was kind of my first game I had worked on, and it was a great learning experience. So I figured I'd back it. And then lo and behold, I think it was like 2020 fall. I think there was an update or some kind of discussion in the chat that, oh, join our Discord and we have it on Tabletop Simulator. And so that's kind of when I started to become active actually. And I played a bunch. There was about like 8, 10 of us that were playing the Tabletop Simulator mod. And it was awesome that the owner and lead designer of first edition there, Chris, Gabrielson there, he was actually active with us, and he'd sit in and watch, and sometimes play, and it was great. Like, and he was listening to feedback, and I think instantly the first thing I saw was there was a lot of potential with the system.
sure.
I was like, it's simple, like it's kind of deceptively simple. So
Yeah,
it's like
yeah,
you just put a cube down, you move your unit. Like you can't like that's so easy to explain to someone, and it's like you can't, like anybody can grasp that. I think what at the back, the learning is kind of on the back end from like every different angle. But like each of the mechanics, buying a unit, you just spend your resources, you put it on the board. Moving a unit, combat, everything simultaneous. You just put your dice out. So like there's not anything at a high level that's complicated, and it's really smooth. And so I actually had a lot of feedback. A lot of the other players had a lot of feedback, and I actually had gone ahead and I was already kind of, I don't say homebrewing, but I was kind of modifying cards of the commanders and the different units to kind of balance it. I felt a bit more, and so I was kind of doing that on the side. And in discussions with Chris, he was kind of like, "Oh yeah, I see a lot of your points, and I probably would have done things, unit balance, especially early on." He was kind of very open with the unit balance, like, "Yeah, I can kind of see what you're saying," because like all main battle tanks, I think in first edition, all gained a speed die. So it was like, so it's kind of one thing where they get to do an extra move if you're not familiar with the game. And so it was kind of like they all kind of felt the same. Maybe they cost different, maybe they had one health. What's actually also deceptive, I know I'm kind of saying this, but like counterly deceptive about Company of Heroes once you play it a bunch is that like having one more health in like any other game does not sound that significant. But in Company of Heroes, like having a little bit of different damage, one more health here, one more range there, in this level of a tactical game is astronomically important. So, and
Hmm.
it plays different because you have to use the unit differently. Like if I have one more health in your unit, I'm probably going to charge at your unit and be more willing to exchange damage because very likely I am to come out on top. So fast forward a little bit, you kept giving feedback. I was actually without access to the art assets, like I was actually modifying them in Photoshop and printing out, like kind of doing a print and play, so that when I received my copy of the game, I was ready to go. Because I was that adamant. Like a lot of us, like really, like felt pretty strong that the game had potential, but we wanted to, get the most out of it. And so a few more discussions, and oddly enough, he actually called me on the Discord server the rabble rouser. I was kind of riling up everyone with like, this game's not perfect. I was very much like positive as much as I could. Like this game's got so much potential, and that's actually if anyone that knows me knows those are the games that frustrate me the most. So if I'm in someone else's community, it's normally because I found a game that's like a 9 or 10 out of 10, and it's like it's so close to being that, but there's just the one flaw with the design that just
Yeah.
creates me because like a game that's a 4 or 5, pass, move on, sell, move on. Like it doesn't, you know, it doesn't hit well with me, but it's the ones that are so close to what I call like greatness, not necessarily perfection because no game's perfect, but like the
Right.
ones that are like, oh man, if it just had this one thing. And so, yeah, he actually hired me. And then initially, yeah, interrupt me at any time if you have any specific questions or anything, because I could just go all day. But
No, you're good.
1 hour is not enough. So comes it was like February, March. He actually hired me, and then the plan was to kind of do not quite. He was working separately on like an errata, which it wasn't like. I know you guys kind of brought this up last time. It wasn't really like a typical errata. It was like, hey, like this. It was more like a little bit. I'd say more of a rule book errata than it was like a errors on cards and components.
Sure.
Might have been there was a couple of like costs of like on certain commanders of a certain unit. There was like the Stug. There was a couple, but it was more of like, hey, this rule isn't perfectly clear. Um, can we improve it? And there was a couple tiny rule tweaks that he put out in errata. And then I was kind of working on what we were originally calling a 1.5. So I think this is kind of like a perfect segue if you want to start interjecting, because it was like, I think nowadays, to kind of give you a point to maybe talk about, but like it was like at first it was an errata, and then we did that. Then there was like a vision for like a 1.5. So when we did a reprint, it was like, hey, here's what's like improvements, units, balancing, right? And then like 6 months later, so like fall 2021, we were like, all right, well, this is too big. This is now officially a second edition, right? So I think that's kind of like going through that process and spending 3 to 4 years on it. I'm like, man, I could talk for days on this topic. So like questions you could ding me from any angle, I could be like, "Yep, I think where's the line? Where is?" Like I was just loving that video. I try to watch yours whenever I can, and I was like, I saw that one. I'm like, oh man, this one's definitely for me. And it was a great episode, and I kind of took notes, and I actually just rewatched it last night, and I'm like, yeah, they touched on a lot of great points. So I don't know, like I kind of told you ahead of time if you want to rehash those points, you have any specific questions, I could kind of come at it from kind of my experience and my perspective. So
Perfect.
there's also questions in the chat if you want me to
There
answer
are a
that
few
too.
questions in the chat, so yeah, let's since we're kind of talking about your background a little bit, let's jump to this question, and then we'll jump
Yep.
into a little more of the second edition part of it. But Jan has a question. Beyond Company of Heroes, what games do you love?
So what's you would think working on Company of Heroes, I was like big into war games. Like I was kind of touching on at the very beginning. But I didn't really come from like I said, I think the industry kind of pitches more of that Euro game perspective, and I kind of went off the deep end, to be honest. Like my shelf was like 50 Euro games, and a lot of them are on my shelf of shame, and I'm just not getting to them, and I'm having trouble finding the time, and a lot of them, to be honest, at this point aren't it was funny because like not many of them were like interesting that much. Like there's a lot of great games. I mean, there's so
Sure.
many great games out there. Like Nations, I'd have to say like Nations is one of my shelf of shame that on paper I would love. I should love it, and I still haven't played it. It's been there like 5 years. I'm like, so getting to the ones I enjoy, oddly enough, it's more at this point kind of the more thematic ones I've kind of evolved. I've kind of learned to shift to actually find what I like, which is kind of I think opposite of in some ways I think what the industry I feel it pushes. So it's like to nowadays I like one thing I'm into is the hidden movement game. So I've been trying to find ones that I liked. And as a designer, when you don't find one you like, you start designing your own. So I've kind of, and I feel like I'm making one that is a little bit different.
Cool.
Um, but I think a lot of campaign games too is the other one. So like those are like the next things I'm kind of working on, where it's like there's so many great games out there.
Yeah.
Um, so like one for instance that kind of got me in was StarCraft, the board game. So it's funny because it doesn't really get credit for deck building. When it kind of came out the same time as Dominion, I think around 2008, 2007, there somewhere in that ballpark. But that's kind of the one. Like Catan is kind of what got me in,
Uh-huh.
and then it was Seven Wonders. Like I had Catan, but I wasn't really into board gaming, if that makes sense. Like I had it, I was a casual gamer, and then oddly enough, this might sound crazy, but like my bachelor party, my brother kind of set up this interesting thing. I loved like he knew me, knew it was my interest. So we actually did bar hopping, but he kind of called ahead to these bars and said, "Hey, do you mind if we play board games?" So he actually had bought Seven Wonders, and we went bar hopping and played Seven Wonders in multiple bars. And oddly enough, to follow up that question back to the hidden movement, I have not played Fury of Dracula. What I'm actually afraid of with that one, I've watched a little bit of gameplay, and I haven't played it. So, like, I don't want to be like prejudging it because I definitely like to experience games. But I've heard it's like at rock paper scissors combat, and then it runs for hours.
Yeah.
So, like, and then how heavy is that game? So normally those hidden movement games are lighter games. So it's like I'm kind of afraid. Oddly enough, my nephew still like he tells one of my nephews says like, "Oh, Fury of Dracula is his favorite." But yeah, that is interesting. I do want to try that one at some point for sure.
I'll interject this one as well if you haven't get a chance to check it out. Black Sonata. It's a good hidden move one to check out. It is
Interesting.
very different because it's a solo hidden movement game. And how the designer created that hidden movement system when you're playing solo is genius in my opinion. So absolutely fantastic. So um, yeah, it's a small box too. It's really easy to get a hold of. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so a lot of a lot of thematic Euros, a lot of hidden movement, can go on to campaigns lately. Is kind of what you've been focusing on. So that's cool.
Yeah, like I could, point out individual games, but it's a lot. Like I don't. It's kind of frustrating because I don't really, because I have a main job and then I do this as kind of a hobby job.
Yep.
A lot of stuff does collect on the shelf of shame, and I do have to sadly be more
Yeah.
selective when I actually do get to play games, unfortunately.
It's funny how that happens because even with this content creation stuff, I play way less games now than I did when it wasn't doing content creation, just
Right.
because your time's doing the back end, right? The other stuff. So, but
Right.
all right. Let me get into a little more of the second edition side. So I
Mhm.
know Jan had a question. I think it's a good one to kind of jump into a little more of that side of it. Does a new entry in the series or system count as a second edition for this discussion? Um, so a
So
new
that's
entry. So
so. Would you say like the latest Dune? Like I don't know the names, but like that's I think the popular one because there was Dune, and then what I would actually call a second edition. So like my answer is yes.
okay,
Um, I and I don't know how I feel about that. I'm actually torn because I come of the mindset as a designer, and I think the designer and publisher aspect I think kind of butt heads on this, right? Because if you have a winner
yeah, Dune
from a
Imperium and Dune
financial
Uprising. Yep, I agree.
right, from a financial decision, it makes a lot of sense to take what you have as a winning formula, tweak it, and resell it, right? And so, oddly enough, that as a consumer, because I'm a consumer too, I think that's kind of where I think a lot of my I don't say like anger or that's too strong of a word, but like what upsets me kind of about it is from a consumer, it's like, aren't you just selling me the same product I already have?
Mm,
And aren't you like discrediting my addition that I paid for this product?
right,
You now think you have fixes for it. You're not even offering me them. You're selling it as a new box. There's no update kit. So that's oddly enough the topic that probably frustrates me the most because it's like I'll give you a perspective is that like if I redid Company of Heroes, I would not do it where it feels close enough to Company of Heroes as a designer because I feel like that's I don't want to say disingenuous. I don't want to I'm not trying to say anything about other people or other decisions because again it makes a lot of sense.
yeah,
And like if a slight re-theme can get that into the hands of some, like I said, like World War II, a lot of people are like, no, I don't want to do World War II. But what if we made a medieval Company of Heroes, right?
right.
I actually had this one fan that really wants us to do a Warhammer one, like a Dawn of War one, and he's like, do it, do it, do it. I'm like, we can't get the license, man. I think it would sell like wildfire as soon as the company gets out there a bit more. But anyway, that's I think that's kind of what I feel about it is that it is kind of treading that line, right? Like I think for some reason consumers are not that upset about it, and I'm kind of curious as to why that doesn't like upset them. I don't know. Like it is interesting to me. It's almost like kind of like a question I would pitch back to the viewers and like to get comments and to have a discussion afterwards or anyone live or any I would love to get in that discussion because that to me really kind of bothers me in some
Yeah,
ways.
as what Chris said here, so that breeds customer cynicism, but we need pubs to stay afloat too, right?
Right.
Yeah, for sure. And the whole feeling of well, I purchased the first edition, right? And now we've got this new version. Does that mean the first edition wasn't playtested enough? Was a rush job, and so I've got an inferior product, right? And that is something that I've may or may not be true, but that's a feeling that does propagate when sometimes the second edition comes up, especially if it comes up in a short period of time from the initial release. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
so Yogi's.
I think it's hard for anyone to really pick on Dune, right? That's probably the worst example because it's so beloved in the industry. It's like, yeah, is it not complete? I personally, I'll just say that I'm not the biggest fan of Dune, but
Mhm.
I'm a little bit more player agency driven. So
Yeah. for sure. Yeah, and then for the yeah, the Yogi said here is I just assume that there are more people that haven't bought played earlier versions, so are still customers to buy the new version. Yeah, for
Right,
sure.
and then those people don't obviously don't care, right? They're like, "Oh, okay, that one happened," and then so it's interesting. Oddly enough, there was like a topic that came up in one Discord I was in the other day that was like someone that was selling their leftover copies through crowdfunding,
Like leftover
and
first edition copies or
I,
something?
oh, I don't even think they're going to a second edition. I don't know. I don't know all the details, but because I
Oh,
didn't look too far into it. But everyone in the Discord that backed the project was like, "I'm done with this company." So I think they backed it at like, "I'm just going to throw out numbers," and I don't know the company and I don't know the details. But I was like, everyone, I was like, "What happened?" So I think it was like, "Hey, here's an all-in copy for $200." And then, hey, we're looking to get rid of our last 10 copies of the game. You can get it for $100. So I think they were just trying to sell off their remaining stock. But like, stuff like that. Back, it's not. I don't think it's quite a second edition question, but it's almost like, hey, we want to sell off our remaining copies just to get rid of them because warehousing costs money too. Like
right.
oddly enough, I think even Bad Crow ran into that with first edition too. Is like, hey, if you have some leftover copies, you're paying these you either have to move them out like if you're paying these regional warehouses, right? Some of them, like I think QML will warehouse it for you. So if you have like after you've done shipping, right, and fulfilling, what do you do with that last 5% of stock, the 5-10%, right? You just keep paying month over month on it, or what do you do? Like there's a lot of interesting questions I think in the industry, but I don't want to get off topic, but
Oh, we'd always get off topic for sure. No worries. Jan says the fact that is out of our hands is that the resale price of a first edition plummets down when a second edition is announced and released, which is true, very true. So the cost of upgrading or cycling to a new game increases. Now, I know for Company of Heroes, you guys specifically did this where you created upgrade packs to go from the first edition to second edition.
yeah.
I'm assuming that was, at least in some part, to help combat or assist with this upgrade in Jan's bring up here.
No, I could touch on that actually with quite a bit. So we were discussing like how does it make sense? Our biggest concern, oddly enough, like I said, I come from oddly enough because I was kind of new as part of a team. I was very much from a backer perspective, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm probably the biggest advocate you'll see in any company of a backer. I try to be because that to me, like I am very much into brand building in terms of like respecting the backers. So, like the first edition backers, I could understand exactly this topic. Like all these points, like, is my product worthless?
Yeah.
Like, to me, it's like, it's a fun game, right? But it's like, we're trying to tell you that things could have been done better, right? Like, or things can be improved, and it is kind of that line. It's like, very much that was brought up in the first video too. It's like, is my copy worthless? Do I just wait? Do I play it? I'm like, if you enjoy it, play it, right?
Right.
Like I
Right.
would say give it a play, and if you enjoy it, play it and enjoy it. But it is like hard as even because I run into that too with other games. It's like I have a game, you're telling me there's some update kit coming. Do I just wait now? Is it broken? Like for instance, like Seven Citadel, I was starting to play that, and there's like this pretty big errata on a lot of components, and I'm like, I printed it out, and I didn't even like. There's like like things you can cut out and sticker over, and I'm like, you know what? I think I'm just gonna play it, enjoy it, and if I run into something that doesn't make sense, then I'll look at the errata, because that's kind of what I encourage others to do too. Just have
Yeah.
fun. You bought it. It's a game. A lot of
Yeah.
time went into it. I'll tell you a little secret. A lot of time went into it,
Yeah.
right? Like it might not be perfect. There might be typos. There might be little issues here and there, but I can guarantee you, it's less than 2% of an issue. Like
Right.
unless like it's a major typo, major like thing that okay, but like just have fun with it, right? Like that's the point of games. So that's kind of my recommendation there. But
Yep.
to get back to the topic, not to sidetrack again, but to get back to second edition, we felt, how do we make it? We had a lot of, the biggest one was to not upset the backers, right? And you're going
Mm-hmm.
to upset people no matter what you do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I think you guys touched on a free update kit at no cost, just shipping.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not I mean, that's great, but then like you can see that companies that do that almost always kind of like you touched on as well that okay, well, what's a new expansion? Because the company needs to stay afloat too,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's like so like for instance, just to give you a frame of mind, you really do need an expansion to kind of it's not like at the end of the day, like that it does matter about profitability, right? So like the core experience, like for instance, Company of Heroes, the core box isn't really that profitable, and it was not profitable in first edition. It was too like the margins just weren't there. So if you look back at our first Kickstarter, what you got for $100 was kind of insane.
Yeah.
You got like 4 factions for $100. So like it was sticker shock when we did our second campaign, and it was like, yeah, we can't do that. Like here's a 2-player set at $100.
Right.
We can't like it just wasn't so like, it does you see a number and you think, "Oh man, this the first edition did 800,000. That's insane. Like they must be rolling in the money." And it's like if your margins aren't there, and I think that's kind of a blessing and curse with crowdfunding is you kind of can eat into those margins to make that more premium product at those price. You really get, I think, a little bit more freedom, but you get a lot more risk, obviously, when you eat into your margins to offer that, right? So there's kind of a lot of things. So that kind of touches on this, right? So we kind of said, okay, what can we do where I very much pushed, let's make it not profitable, which sounds like a bad business decision right out the gate, right? But let's make it so that we have the freedom to fully develop, fully work on a second edition, and make it as polished as possible, as humanly possible. Like now we have the biggest thing, and you touched on this as well, I think, in that is now you have all of these invested backers who now want the polished product. So you have a lot of play testers. A
It's true.
lot of
Yeah.
people that are much more willing to play test. It is really true. And it's kind of I don't know, kind of almost frustrating from my perspective of how hard it is to get play testers, before and after, because it's like you got play testers coming out of the woodworks, and it was like, oh great, we got more people to get feedback from, and like we took full advantage of that. Like when I joined the team, I said to Chris, and he didn't understand. I think it was like when he heard this number, he thought I was ridiculous. But I said, listen, with all these factions and all these commander combinations, this game needs to be play tested 1,000 times, 1,000. Because I come from the software development, so
Uh-huh.
I like that's my background, so I know how much. I mean, it isn't a video game software development. It's kind of other applications, but I know that iterative process
Yeah.
of like tweak, okay, bug fix, move on. So I knew with the scale that it was going to be an insane amount, and he was kind of like, I don't really believe you. It was almost like it wasn't like he didn't quite say that, but he was kind of like,
Yeah.
I don't know. Like we did a lot of work, and it's like so yeah, so we settled on I think it was like around 50 there for the update kit, but we really wanted to pack it. And so we redid I redid all the commanders 9 times. So like
Wow.
I might like if you ask me privately, like and now I'm saying it publicly, but I tell people it's a ninth edition because I would basically redo everything top to bottom based on feedback, based on play testing, update the commanders, update the building boards, any tweaks, any balances, and then let it sit for 3 months. 3 months later, get all the feedback, rebalance it. Again, I did that year, like I did that like so like 4 times a year. Boom, 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 boom. You get to 3 years, and all of a sudden it's like a ninth edition. And so that was just from that perspective. But there was tweaks to like, hey, one thing like I let sit for the longest time was like, why is OKW broken? And I was like, is it really that broken? Like one faction, because it breaks a lot of the rules. It's like, does it need to be, you know, nerfed in some other way? And so I ended up basically, it costs more to get their buildings out. So they're delayed. And it's kind of hidden in the cost. But to get to tier 3 is 4 more manpower and 2 more fuel. And why I came to that realization was halfway through all this iteration, I played this game against a pretty smart guy. Don't get me wrong. He's a very quick learner, very smart guy, very great player. But my first game against him, he's like, "Oh, I loved OKW from the video game." And I'm like one of like, not to toot my own horn, I'm not really one to do that, but I'm like, because I've been neck deep in this. I've been a pretty one, one of the best players, and he played OKW, and my first game against him, I'm like, yeah, this isn't really like you're you're outperforming what you should be able to do. And I can tell anytime there's a major issue is what I do is I go into like this analysis paralysis cycle as a designer. So you don't want to play typically with me in a game because I'll sit there for like a half hour and I'll be like, I'll just literally like a computer program. I'll be like, well, if I do this, this is gonna happen. This is gonna happen. This, like, you know what I mean? And I can
Sure.
see because of how I've watched 150 plays on TTS of this game at this point. Like this, and they're not short games.
No, they're not.
So like 150 games of it is kind of astronomical. So I was like, yeah, look, nope, OKW needs a nerf. So yeah, so we ended up going with for second edition the update kit, updating the building boards, updating the commanders, and we're like, you know what? You could argue that hey, this shouldn't be an update kit, but we wanted to make sure everyone was baseline at the same spot as close as possible. There are some things that were obviously going to be different. One point, the biggest point of contention was the maps, oddly enough,
Mm,
because I had this idea. I said, listen, the maps, first of all, the maps aren't perfect. There's a lot of lessons learned. Map design is kind of a very specific subset of game design.
hmm.
Like if you go into the video game industry, you actually have like map designers for games because that's like it's something that you have to learn. You have to study the game from a different perspective than like, hey, here's the factions, right? But then like even still, we have some maps that, for instance, Soviets are just better on. Like you can't have every single map where all the factions are balanced. It just you basically get to a point where there's no flavor on the maps
Hmm.
because you know what I mean. They just become the same because you can't have any differences. So we ended up coming up with the new maps, and oh man, that was an insane amount of work. Yeah, I took that one on. We actually ended up modifying our world builder pack
Hmm.
from first edition, and those maps were like blank slates. And in some ways, that was good for backers, but I think it was a niche set of backers, right? Because it's a blank map, and we gave you all these tiles to put on the map.
Hmm.
But to do that, to set up a map and build a map, first of all, is going to take you like an hour. And that's like, you're like, it's cool, but it's going to take you an hour. And also, you have nothing. And it's going to take you an hour because you have to add stuff because it's literally a blank slate. So it's like, there's no red line, so there's no like inhibiting movement, there's no cover, there's like a game has a lot of nuance, tactical nuance with buildings and cover and lines that you can't go through, like rock walls and stuff. So and then the bigger thing, and I really don't want to knock any backer, and if someone listens to us, they might know who I'm talking about. But there was these two guys who I absolutely adore. They're two of our best playtesters. But they went for like a year and a half, and they would just design their own maps. And I would watch them play on their own maps, and it was like again, kind of that map designer experience. It was like, what are you guys trying to like when you design a map? It's really difficult because you have to try to do something different.
Yeah.
It's like, let's just, if you just like paint a canvas, you could paint a canvas, right? But the problem is, it's not just painting a canvas. It's like, how is this canvas different from that canvas,
Sure.
right? And so if you think of purely art, I think it's a lot more freedom, right? Because of like, oh, hey, if I add a moon to this picture, it's totally different and like different focuses. But if you think of that in a game as tactical as Company of Heroes, you're like, you don't even want to know the number of hours I put redesigning these maps, right? Like 2,000, 3,000 hours just to redesigning the maps because you have to, like, if map A and map B are the same, why are you playing map B versus map A? Why don't you just always play map A? And that was kind of one thing with our game. So oddly enough, just the new highlighted map that end up calling Moro River, I redesigned that map probably 10 times. Like like from the ground, like almost from the ground up. Later, obviously, it was just tweaks, but it's a lot of work.
Yeah,
And
for
so,
sure.
again, not to knock those guys, but it was like, what is your map trying to do different? So when I was watching it, I'm like, your game isn't really from the map you played last week to the map you played this week. What are you trying to like? What decisions are you trying to pull out of players, and what are you trying to encourage? What are you trying to discourage? It's very difficult to make a map. So second edition, what we end up going with is what we call the legacy map pack, where we updated those maps, and now here's some tiles to tweak those. So there's already buildings, there's already cover, and then now, oh, let's just add a building here.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and like maybe from players' perspective, you would think that's not that big a deal. But again, I can tell you, as a designer, you add a random building somewhere on the map, it can massively change the outcome of the game. So
Absolutely. I do want to jump back to a statement that Chris had here on there. It says, I'm curious if pubs generally lose money on upgrade packs. They're often quite cheap compared to Heft.
no, I mean,
So,
I mean, the obvious answer is is yes. So like,
okay.
I like, you have to make money. Like, you know what I
Right.
mean? So it's like, so expansions. I think almost everyone knows. I don't think there's any secret there that expansions typically are where there's less components. You look at component counts of any. I don't want to ruin people from buying expansions, but if you look at an expansion, you're very usually getting not that many components. And then you look at the cost, you're like, it's half the cost of the game, and it's like a tenth of the amount of the components. Something doesn't really add up. But that's how and if you think of it as trying to support your favorite publishers, that's
Sure.
how you support them. So
Hmm.
like, it depends on what if you're trying to like, hey, I got to get the most bang for my buck, right? Yeah, just get the core game. I mean, I would tell that to anyone, but
Hmm.
to help and that's kind of in some ways, frustration with especially Kickstarters is like they get up to, like, obviously company. I don't, we don't even have to go there. The all-in price is probably one of the highest ever done on crowdfunding. But and you'll get some backers. I actually just read a comment on BGG the other day, like, oh, they just they could have done a smaller scale of the hexes and miniatures. They went expansion heavy, but again, our first edition core box was not profitable. It
Yeah, not
wasn't like a
sustainable
sustainable business
for
model.
sure.
So it's like, do you want to? And then I think I'm going to actually argue that this is a good thing for everyone, because those that are like, hey, I don't really have that much disposable income. What do you recommend? Publishers probably don't like me, but I always tell everyone, just get the base box. Like, I pitch that to every single person. Don't get more. Just get, you know what? How often are you going to play this? That's my first question. Are
Sure.
you going to play this week in, week out? Is this going to be your lifestyle game? Or are you just another one of us in the hobby that's a player who has way too many games on their shelves, bounces game to game, plays a game a couple times a year? Boom, just get the core game.
Yeah.
Like, if you're going to play Company of Heroes second edition, just a few, like 3, 4, 5 times max a year, and you're not really going to dive into it, just get the core box. Really do encourage that, because you're going to get a great experience. I can tell you that we put a lot in. There's 6 base commanders with the one. There's kind of the universal commander, 7 commanders. And you think of it just 2 factions, right? It's, if you just want to say 6 and 6, that's 36 different permutations of just commanders, right? It's just 2 factions, 6 different commanders. And so that's a lot of games and the commanders are very impactful, right? So you're saying, hey, here's $100 game you can play 36 times and not have the same matchup. I know a lot of people like to oh, with all the permutations, there's millions. It's like, do you care about millions? How often are you going to play this game?
Fair enough. Yeah, it's true.
Right? And like, to be honest, there's so much, and a big effort of second edition was to make each and every of the 9 core units in each faction a lot more viable. In particular, the biggest culprit was anti-tank guns. And in some ways, it's still the toughest unit to get right, because if it's too good, then you can't go vehicles. Because if
Sure.
like if you have something that counters vehicles too well, then you can't go vehicles. So it is a very delicate line there.
So like yeah, Company of Heroes, the second edition of that game seemed primarily focused on balance, right? Tweaking balance across the board. But I know there's more to that as well, and there's more that maybe drives the second editions. I'll give another example. Well, maybe it's not exactly a second edition, but Deep Rock Galactic, what
Hmm.
they did for their game is they produced a very distilled core experience,
Hmm.
and they wanted to get that in people's hands right away. And then the plan was to come out and complete that vision with expansions later. It's not really a second edition, but it does add all the additional rules in it and upgrades the whole experience. So like I feel like there's like different approaches there. Like, can you elaborate a little bit more on
I
maybe your experience for a second edition on that side?
I can certainly say, yeah, I can touch on that from a couple different perspectives. One, I think that's actually genius, and why that's genius, and I think that's kind of the same thing for us with second edition, is there was a lot, just talking specifically in this case about Company of Heroes, there's a lot of pushback and discussions with Chris. One of my last discussions with him before we lost him was, do we need to add this? Like,
Mm,
like the rules, are they too much? Is it? And so I think with second editions, you gain a lot of freedom because you're a lot of, like, 50, it was 50% new, 50% veteran backers. Not only do you know what people are liking about the game, you're also knowing what they don't like, and you know where you can expand. You learn a lot. Like, so I don't know what their model was up front, like, hey, we're just cutting out all this content that we're saving for later. I don't know the story, but I really recommend more, get the core game out there, get the feedback, then design and develop what how to improve it at that point, if that makes sense, rather than
mm,
just like, okay, this is too much, we're going to cut. And some designs can do that. Like, I think there's a lot of games that are kind of very broad, and like, oh, hey, let's add this, one mechanic of, like for instance, Company Heroes, like a co-op mode, right? So like
yeah,
the base game is a head-to-head.
yeah.
90% of our player base is one versus one. So why go through? I'd actually almost I would almost guess the solo co-op mode is probably going to be our second popular mode of play, and then getting to higher player counts. um but no, I think that's pretty smart. I think for Company of Heroes, we did a lot of that. So I think that, unless, like, for people that haven't followed along, there was not only balance, unit balance is one thing that I touched on in depth, but, and I could go further, but we don't have to. but but there was a lot of mechanics that just didn't work, and I think the easiest culprit is our turn order system.
uh,
Uh, so the turn order system in first edition, that was actually what was the most frustrating and got me, I think, on the team originally, is that anytime, not to knock Chris, not to knock anyone who took advantage of this, gamers are going to try to win, right?
yeah.
So let's just kind of get that out of the way. A lot of gamers are playing to win, and you can't fault gamers. So Chris, anytime he was in a game, he would literally do whatever it would take to win the game. And again, it's almost everyone, but coming from a designer perspective, he kind of knew all the loopholes to kind of abuse within the given rule set. So, for instance, there's this one game where he was playing where he masterfully could hold this bridge indefinitely. It was actually the first edition 12 palm map, very narrow bridge, very critical to the map. And he knew how to hold it, because if you kept going, oddly enough, normally in the game you want to go second. But if you were behind in victory points at the start of the new round, you could choose who's going first or second. So there end up being this kind of gaminess to the system, where if you were behind on victory points, you could, like, and this was kind of different than an example I was given, but you could always go second and then intentionally not capture victory points
Huh.
and just bleed all of your enemy units off the board. And by the end of the game, the score looks close, but the board doesn't look close. And that
Interesting.
was that was the optimal way to play, because you could go second. Whoever went second, you knew you had 9 command cubes, you knew you had 9 actions to do, and whoever went second could literally, the amount of analysis, if you like watch someone play, whoever was going first in the turn order would spend 10, I might be exaggerating, but could spend like 10, 15 minutes on their turn, try to come up with the optimal play. And then everyone second would be like, oh,
Yeah.
and just like, you're like, I didn't even see that. Right. And so it was more exaggerated than team games, oddly enough.
Sure.
So like 2v2s, that was kind of where it became obvious, because when we were playing 2v2s of first edition, it was blatantly obvious that this turn order thing, I think a lot of people that, if you really tried to sink your teeth into like playing 2v2, you really couldn't in first edition because of this problem, because you could sit there for 45, like even longer. You're chatting with your teammates. What can we do? How do we progress? How do we move forward? How do we capture these points? And then the team that went second would be talking to each other. Okay, we could solve this problem. We could solve that problem. We could solve this problem. Like all the fires would go out, and then it would be a massacre. So
Interesting.
the operations deck was kind of one thing that I had, oddly enough, from that earlier design, that I was like, you know what? I know that game's never going to get published. I have this mechanic in it. The second team just can't know the number of moves they're going to make. That's kind of what it accomplishes. And if they don't know when the round is going to end, they have to play in the moment. So they have to play for now. They could take risks, but they're like the game theory, if that makes sense, behind it. You have to play going second, like it's going to end right now. And so if they have to play like it where it's going to end right now, they have to play optimally for the moment, and therefore can't know that there's 9 cubes, 9 actions. And so that arguably is the biggest change for players who play it repeatedly, who, the ones that do get to spend more time in it are diehard players. That's kind of the biggest change, oddly enough. And then the other one is Assault, which is essentially capturing an individual hex. It's so critical to the system. So the other problem is, if like someone that owned a victory capture point, could just keep throwing bodies on it, and because there was no way in first edition to move onto a spot where an enemy unit was, there was no way to capture the points. So I mean, I could go on, like you could have me on for 5 hours. I'm sure it would bore people, but there is a lot. It's a lot more than balance changes. There's more
Right.
victory capture points, which is an astronomical problem, because you only have, let's say you have 5 units on the board, right? In first edition, almost every 1v1 map only had 3 capture points. So if you had ownership over them, it was so easy to defend them. So
Mm.
the comeback potential was nil. You
Mm-hmm.
really could not make a comeback in the game. So there was 2 big measures for second edition. Well, there's really 3 big measures. One is there's a lot more resources on the map. So we definitely increased income across the board. There's a lot of spots that are double resource points. The next one is that there's almost always 6 in the 1v1s. I think a couple have 5 capture points, but it makes you have to spread your forces thin, and you can't defend and capture everything. You have to pick and choose your battles. And the last one, which, oh my goodness, was this obvious from some of our die-hard playtesters, was that whoever has the most capture points at the end of the game gets 3 bonus victory points.
Mm-hmm.
And this changes everything. It's like a small rule. Oddly enough, one guy I'm close with actually is upset about this rule. But I'm like, it's all like the video game was all about the capture points. In my opinion, how I see war, it's about controlling the land and
Sure.
capturing the land.
Sure.
And to me, that's the theme of the game anyway. So no, what was obvious is there was this one game I watched, again with our 2 diehard playtesters, where the player that was in the lead had like 5 capture points. Like it had most of the capture points on the board, and they did the math. And if they just retreated all of their units the final round, because if you defeat an enemy unit, you get a victory point. So if they
Right.
retreated their units, wouldn't lose any units, and wouldn't give the opponent victory points, they wouldn't lose, even if the opponent captured every capture point on
Interesting.
the map.
Yeah.
So he did it. He went ahead and did it. I'm like, nope. All right, guys. Thank you. Thanks for thanks for playing. This has got to get fixed.
Right.
So like the very next play test, I was like, all right, guys, and they were both happy about it, because they were like, definitely the person who did it was like, I don't want to be doing this, but I want to win the game, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
and
Makes
so
sense.
that was obvious to me at that point, where it's like you have that rule, the assault rule. Those are there's just
There's a
There's
lot.
so this is really a ninth edition. Like it's
Yeah.
not just unit balance, it's 3 years of a second edition, not like of a first edition, right?
Right.
This
Right.
is of a game that was already done, if you will, done, shipped. How do we improve it? And I'm sure other publishers would come in and say, like, especially, the one thing I wanted to touch on, because you guys touched on it last time, was how long is it in the cooker? And
Correct.
and so what I say with scope, I actually thought about this a little bit, and I would say it's cubed. So like the more complex of the game in terms of its scope, it's cubed the amount of work. So it's not just exponential. It's really like not to the second power. It's really to like the third power. How much time and effort across the board. And I'll be honest, like we didn't do ourselves a lot of favors with second edition. I think that's kind of where coming out with shipping here, like, we didn't get into that, but like when you have so many SKUs, it's gonna
Mm.
slow things down,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's a second edition. And so that's kind of where at this point we don't want to make any mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to have any costly, issues. We get to the regional hubs and
Mm-hmm.
something, there was a lot of issues with first edition, and a lot of them were out of our hands. It was the
Mm-hmm.
canal issue at the time, the shipping, the pandemic. A lot of things impacted us. We never came
Sure.
to Chris would find out ways to make it happen behind the scenes, but we never asked backers for money. And it's that was obviously a touchy subject for a lot of companies at the time, but
Right.
we never did that. And to be honest, we fulfilled, we did what it took to get it done. And it's very tough. And so second edition, there was a lot insane amount of work that went into it. I would be again, I haven't worked for other companies. I haven't worked on other second editions, but I could say a game of this scale, it's astronomical to do a
Yeah.
second edition, especially to the degree we did. We left no rocks unturned. Like that one last thing that last argument I got in with Chris was over splash damage. So like splash damage, for those who don't know, is like the one way in the game where you could damage multiple units with a single unit's attack. And in first edition, it was like a smaller, you know what I mean? It's a smaller checkbox, but it came like after watching, 100 plays at that point, I was like, this isn't really changing the dynamics of the game. So should it either be cut or does it need to be redesigned? And so we discussed it, and I think we fell on the fact that, okay, well, I want it to be impactful for team games, so let's make it so units can get 2 HE splash. So first edition, no unit in the game could get more than 1 splash damage. And 1 splash damage isn't that impactful. So when you're dealing with 1s and 2s in games with such low numbers, the 1 to 2 is a 100% increase,
That's
right?
true.
And so in some ways, I like from in my opinion, designs I like to start with 2 as a base number already, because 2 to 3 is already a smaller increase than 1 to 2, because that 100% increase on any stat, anything. Like I was watching Derek's Kanji Studios there, Iridia there, and some character, I think some race combination has only 1 health. And I think everyone's reaction to like, how do you have 1 health in a game? And the character I think he ended up I think the Path of Light, I think has like 4. So like
Yeah.
I haven't played the game yet. I'm looking forward to playing that. I'm gonna try to make time for that in the near future. But like that's scary to me. Like how do you play a game with
Yeah.
having 1 health versus 4? That's 400%, right? That's insane.
It's a big difference.
So
Um, I want to jump into a little bit of kind of summarizing what I'm hearing as a whole, a little bit, if you don't
mhm.
mind.
Go ahead.
Um, I feel like back in the day, and I'm feeling like I'm dating myself a little bit, but I remember Fantasy Flight Games, this
Mhm.
publisher. They became known throughout the community that hey, when they put out a game, we know they're going to put out expansions in the future, and they're going to tweak in the future.
Mhm.
The initial release is always going to be a small subset. I'll use the acronym MAP, minimum MVP, sorry, minimum viable product is
Yep.
kind of what their goal was. And then they would, they put it out there, and then on the next expansions, or they would then update it, all that fun stuff after the fact. And that they became very known for that.
Mhm.
And for a while there, Kickstarter and crowdfunding kind of was similar in that you put out a portion of the product, and later on you would come back with revisions. Well, I feel like we've kind of gone away from that for a long time now. Where like Simon, for example, whenever they drop a big campaign, they have a core set and like 20 different expansions and all the stuff at one time, right? And I'm kind of feeling like maybe the best approach, maybe what it should be swung back the other way to getting back to that core experience, knowing that you come back, you've got a fan base already, which
Mhm.
will be able to play test. And then it's not necessarily a second edition, but you're gonna come back and tweak things. You're gonna add to it with expansions and maybe tweak the core experience a little bit, but without having to do a whole second edition revamp of all this content.
Right.
Is that like
So
is this
there's
ultimately what the community as a whole and like product design, all that stuff would be best heading towards? I don't want to like speak collectively for everything, but like that's what I'm feeling right now, hearing this discussion, hearing all the nuance.
Mhm. So I think first of all, there's so many different sides to this because the first divide is retail versus crowdfunding.
Sure.
So like that's the first divide. The second divide is big publisher versus small publisher. And the third is running a sustainable business, right? So like there's three things that are competing in that. So for instance, a small publisher, right? Everything is stacked against you in crowdfunding. Which is kind of interesting to me because a part of me wants to start my own, publishing company. To be honest, part of me does,
Yeah.
but I don't want to do the back end, right? I would love to have a partner that does the back end. I work on the product and we work together. That's kind of what I would love
Yeah.
because that stuff does not really interest me. But there's a lot to do back there. There's
For
a
sure.
lot to. So like a lot of those solo self publishers, right? Like if you isolate them, they have everything stacked against them in this, especially more so in this exact topic. Because the smart thing to do as a, is kind of almost what you're saying, have a core box experience. The problem is what crowdfunding has become is again, not I don't want to talk, knock Simon. They have clearly, they have their market, they do what they do, but they put a lot of pressure on the little guys by having this business model. And this is
Mm,
kind of their business model. It works. Again, I'm not trying to knock them. They're a fantastic company. I've bought a lot of their games. Um, but that puts more pressure on the little guy to compete, right?
sure.
So there's a lot of issues at hand here. I could talk this one topic I could talk about for an hour. I know we're kind of out of time, but like this topic is a fantastic topic because like I'll give you a perfect example. Retail uh within the last, I guess it's kind of going on now for a while, but like fourth edition of Twilight Imperium, I haven't played it, but I think from what I understand of it, like they again nailed that model of like, hey, third edition with all the expansions is this grand experience. Here's a new fourth edition. It's clean, it's simple. It's like you just said, the minimum viable product. They nailed that. Boom. Then they had an expansion that kind of fleshes it out and makes it at least closer, maybe in some ways, more fleshed out than third edition, maybe still not quite there, right? But that from a retail perspective, I think that's genius. I think
Mm,
obviously they proved it through the test of time. They have big complex games. You do a minimum viable product, boom. But the crowdfunding space, I don't want to say it's tainted. I don't want, again, I'm not trying to throw shade on any company, right?
sure,
Because
sure.
because certain companies that's their model, right? And then you have like stalwarts of the industry of someone like Jamie Stegmaier of Stonemaier Games, who said after Scythe, he's like, he kind of said, listen, I don't need to do crowdfunding anymore. We're big enough where we don't need it, right? So
Right.
there's definitely a lot of different perspectives on it. Um, and I think because of that, because different companies use it differently, it really falls. And I think the backers and supporters don't like, some of them obviously I think do this, but it kind of falls on each individual person to just make their own financial decisions. Who do you want to support, right?
Right.
Like, do you want to, like, I personally try to go out of my way to support those small self publishers. Maybe their product isn't as good in the end, right? But I understand, like, but I think I understand it a little bit differently than I think a lot of backers and gamers in the industry. But I understand how much work it is to do that. And maybe not 100%, maybe only 95%, but I understand how much work it is to do that. So I think for them, they are up against more barriers where they should be doing a more minimal viable product. But if you go to crowdfunding, you're expected to have an expansion. I think that's kind of, you know, unless you're kind of already have your following, if you're big enough, if you could do some kind of insane level of production, again, to touch on Iridia, I mean, everyone's raving about it. That you open the box and it's like, personally, I'm not a fan of those boxes, but because like I just can't open them without destroying them, so that feels horrible. Like I spent so much money and then I just ripped it. I think the Path of Valor box, I think I already like dented it. I feel bad. It's like this a little thin box, but then like so you could tell how much work went into a product like that.
Right.
I think I don't even know what the original date was, but they get so much leeway. And then you look at designers like Cole Weir, man, that guy puts out insane designs, so out there, so like he can spend so much time after the design, like for like arcs, from what I heard from him doing in videos, like he spent so much time after the crowdfunding to really polish that game,
Sure.
where a lot of you like as a smaller self pub that you're not out there, someone that it doesn't have like those two are like I think great. Like, and then I think Cole does some of his own designs too, but like until you get your name out there, everything is stacked against you, and there's no way to even like I can talk about that for hours of how many different things are stacked against you.
Yep.
So it's really like what is your goal with your company? How are you profitable? And a lot of it sadly is, I don't want to say tricking the backers, but it's like backers, like everyone wants the best deal.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people will buy from online retailers just to save $5 on a copy of a game, and that's not supporting their local flag stores, and that's hurting retailer. Like, so it's like, at the end of the day, how do you compete financially? How do you make a viable product at the right price point? There's an insane amount that goes out there, and I think crowdfunding does allow like kind of indie publishers a little bit more leeway. But at the end of the day, you advertise, hey, our base game is this much. And I think that's one way to do it, is really to have like a retail edition, even if you're not planning to go to retail, is to have that cheaper edition for those people that, hey, I want this game. What's the minimum I could pay? I don't need the miniatures. I don't need this. That's kind of what I encourage. That's kind of how I am trying to design games, especially going forward. I think Company of Heroes, it's too late. The ship has sailed on that. There's no way to kind of I thought about it, and I kind of pushed for a little bit. I'm like, is there a way we could make a hex encounter version or some other way of this system? Because the system I think is got a lot of potential, and I think it's got a big fan base.
For sure.
Can we make a less expensive version that is more retail friendly? Because to be honest, it's not a retail friendly game. The,
No.
the margins, even still, like at some point, you know what I mean? Like the product is just so grand, you're really just getting the diehards, the niche target audience that can spend, the insane amount of monies on an individual game.
I
So it's a tough topic, right? I think, I could approach it from every different angle. I can give you a perspective.
I'm glad you brought that up because I do have I got it scheduled yet, but in February I plan to have a couple indie designers coming on to talk about that very topic, like what are the challenges and what are the difficulties, what are the learnings on trying to get a product out there, because that is, like you said, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. There's a lot of things that I think from a consumer side and the community side that we may not be aware of, that I'm hoping can talk about and shed light on that. But yeah, that'd be sometime in February. I've got a couple of designers lined up for that one. Um, One thing I want to touch on, and probably won't wrap it after this, is
Yep.
I know I'll get back to Deep Rock one. The Deep Rock one was interesting to me because this is the first time I remember going into the first crowdfunding they did. They said, "Hey, by the way, here's the product. This is a fully realized product. It's gonna play. You guys are gonna have. I hope you guys are gonna really enjoy it, all that fun stuff. But we are planning to come back. It was very clearly stated that they are coming back with more content, right? And I
Mhm.
wonder if laying that out up front would help with folks on their comfort level, because that way, if you know that they're coming back with more content, this is not the end of it and stuff like that, then it's not a surprise. Because I wonder if the surprise element of, oh, by the way, second edition, oh, by the way, third edition, and people aren't prepared for that. They still have the old copies, and maybe that has some maybe ill feelings towards it.
No, I think from that specific angle, um, I would say is difficult, right? Because I think that is that Deep Rock Galactic that a license,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So
licensed with
so once
Ghost Ship
so
is the ones that own it, and then the company that produced it was Mood.
so I don't know how other companies do their licensing agreements, but I can say from our licensing agreement, you can maybe come up with an agreement where you have a long enough license where you know you're coming back for at least kind of a reprint plus expansion.
Sure.
But even still, you're likely, especially with a license, you're likely to kind of run up to like some kind of an agreement date, some kind of thing if there's delays, right? So more so I'd say that's I don't want to say risky, but I think it is a little bit more risky to take that approach with a licensed product.
Yeah.
I would still say from anyone in the community, if you see a licensed product, do not just assume there's going to be a reprint. A lot of different, if it's a video game license, whatever, right? A lot of those other companies, you could lose a contact. I can talk about contacts for a long time. You lose a contact, you don't find the right contact. Okay, how do you get in touch with that company? You're
Yeah.
done. You're done. You're out in the water. I can touch on that a little bit with Company of Heroes. For anyone that's not familiar, Sega was the owner of the rights, but it kind of reverted back to Relic. So, we were kind of looking to extend that license, and we kind of I can touch on that as well. If there was more time, but there's not. So, like, I think even if you have a core product and it is your own, you know, let's say IP, your own, intellectual property, your own thing. Even that I think is tricky to say, hey, I can guarantee because there's no guarantee. I hate to say there's no guarantees in life. There really isn't. There really isn't. Because if it's not profitable, if you're a small self-publisher and some kind of life event comes in the way,
Yeah.
I really, I think you're already pushing the boundaries with like, I don't know how big, again, not to keep harping on those far off games, but it's such an amazing product, like in the box. Like, that was what, 4 years? Like, it's like, and that's, and if you know that going in, right? Like, they're able to do that and they have the confidence of their community where you have some other communities that aren't like maybe as understanding or like if you're backing a project and you see a day that's, oh, we're advertising it's going to ship in 4 years. I don't know what, again, I don't really know what their numbers were,
Right.
but like you're like a lot of people won't back crowdfunding because of the uncertainty, right? And I don't really think saying we're coming back. I personally don't think that's I'm risk adverse, and I think that's part of why I don't want to start my own company, to be honest. Um, but I think that's difficult to promise that. I would be very hard pressed to say, look, I could promise we're coming back. We're gonna do a reprint. And it could look like all the signs are doing that, but to publicly state that, I think that's a big ask. I
Sure.
really do, because you don't know. First of all, you don't know how well the product's gonna do.
Yeah.
Right. Even like so like that's the one advantage crowdfunding kind of does have because it is a pre-ordering system. So like, hey, if we get 5,000 backers, we're gonna reprint, right? That's normally a good auto number that I would probably say is like, look, if we get 5,000 backers, maybe to say that, right? Maybe to say, hey, if we get 5,000 backers, we'll be back.
There you go.
Like that's not really a stretch goal, but like
Sure.
if we hit this many, one of our stretch goals is we'll be back, guys. We'll have more content. Maybe that would make more sense. But you know, definitely if you have a smaller print run, it gets tough. Like if you're not doing the 1,500 copies, uh, 1,000 copies, 500 copies, those a lot of these smaller self-publishers, man, you know what I mean? Like you're probably thinking of the bigger ones, but a lot of the even smaller ones don't have a licensed product. They're put up their blood, sweat, and tears into their product. So it's tough, right? So like if you have a license, again, there's that issue. If you're having a minimum order quantity, really ideally you want to get like the magic number is like 10,000. After that, you stop getting reductions in manufacturing costs. It's kind of like at that point, you're just scaling up. You're not really getting reductions. So 5,000 to me is that great number that you really want to hit. 1,500 is kind of the minimum number, but those are different. That's just a rough guideline. But to
Sure.
me, that's the biggest thing you're concerned with. After that, it's really just you managing the money, right? Like,
Sure.
do you have the margins in the product cost? Is there any issues with shipping going on? Like, there's a lot of things. Like, once you learn the industry, like, you can just assume. For instance, I think you guys touched on a little bit shipping costs.
Yeah.
I'll give you a little ballpark. Just assume shipping costs are like, get a quote, and then shipping costs. Just assume every January 1st goes up by 10%. Just so, like, you know what I mean. So it's going to be 10% higher in 2026 from what it is now. 10% higher in 2027 than that, right? So, like, you can just have ballparks that you can kind of, I'm not saying you have to be a financial genius, and I'm not saying it's simple. I'm not saying one way or the other, but there's a lot of things you could do once you understand the industry to hedge bets and understand the financial part of it for sure. But still, I think that's a bold, you know, claim in my opinion
Yeah,
to
I
say,
think
hey, we're coming back.
you have a good point about the licensing because I know, and this might be a really good topic to bring on with some other designers because I know like Marvel Legendary, big deck building game. They've been producing contents for more than 10 years now. There are some very sought after expansions, and they weren't able to reprint them just because the licensing behind the scenes changed. And it
Right.
took years and years and years till that finally get cleaned up because the one thing about the Marvel license is the movie industries they pass around licensing right to characters, so like that was an impact to that game as well. So like I think that'd be a really good topic to bring up. I might try to see if I can get that set up for maybe in March or something like that. But I know kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But yeah, this was a really good chat. I think there's a lot more to dive into on this. I can
Just
tell.
a quick follow up to, I
Sure.
think, Yan or Jan. Sorry, I don't know the
Yep, Jan.
pronunciation.
Yep.
Um, Nobody ever tells the public how many copies they print. And that is another part of it as well. How much are you willing to dip into your coffers or the profit margin to kind of invest in yourself, right?
Sure.
How are you going to get rid of how are you going to, like, I say get rid of, right? But how are you going to sell those copies, right? Are you going, do you have a retail model? Do you not? All these things take time, right? The time that you have to manage. Are you going to try to, like, a lot of smaller self publishers don't really want to get into retail because there's a lot of hurdles
Sure.
and a lot of barriers to get into retail. You need to have a product at a certain price point, which is something that was more of a bigger factor for like Avatar for us because it's a smaller game, and so we really wanted to have that option to pursue that a little bit. And that's kind of one thing I encouraged the new owner there at Bad Crow to do, was to say, hey, look, can we look and start transitioning away from licensed products into our own brand? So that's kind of one thing we're looking at going forward. Is we definitely want to, if we can get the extension, which things are so far, we're in discussions with. Hopefully it goes well to keep company going. That's our flagship product. But that's one thing where licenses, some, people are willing to deal with. There's a lot of pros and cons to licenses. That could be a long, I mean, I could, not to like bogart your channel, but man, you could have me back. I could talk for days on all these different topics. And no, you can certainly go to others. I wouldn't be offended, but no, I'm like, I love all these topics. I think I have a lot of opinions and a lot of experience dealing with this stuff. And like, one game just to touch off that, like, I spent insane amount of time on planning on it, us trying to get one license. It fell through in 2022. I tried another one in 20, same game, same design, kind of a second edition of it, spent thousands of hours on it again. That license fell through, right? So it's like there's a lot of frustrations. There's a lot going on. It's, I think a lot of smart, typically you just want to, the smart idea would probably be to, like, here's the product, here's kind of a functional product to show to the company you're trying to get the license from, then stop working on it. It was probably the smart thing I should have done, right? Wait until the license is done, then work on it again, right? So there's a lot of lessons learned that I could give. And
Sure.
And now there's a lot of different topics, but yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast, and I love doing these things. If I had time to do a YouTube channel, I would. I don't though. I would absolutely love to. I don't know if I'd have a fan base following, but I could talk about a lot of topics, on game design, on publishing. I love going on. So thank you for having me, and if you ever want me back, I love it.
Of
So
course, of
greatly
course.
appreciate you having me on.
I love it. Yeah. So speaking of talking more about this, if you guys are interested in diving more of this, because I know we have kind of run out of time here, but I know Brian is on our Discord on Co-op Guild, so you can go check out that. And Bad Crow Games has their own Discord where you're over there. I'm sure you can ask questions on that side as well. So a lot of opportunity to dive into more of this, but. Um, like I said, I already gave you a little sneak peek that I do have more talks with other designers and people the community as a whole and industry for next month. And so I'm gonna try to see if I can get at least one each month to bring different people on. So that's
That's
the
awesome.
goal. So yeah, and Matthew said thank you for talking with Brian. It was awesome having you on and hearing all the nuance and insight behind this. So and I'm betting we might have you on definitely in the future, especially when Come to Fear second edition delivers. So that might be kind of fun to have a
That'd be
chat.
awesome. Yeah.
So
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I'll try to, at least pop in if there's any comments
for
after the
sure,
fact. But thank you for people with the questions, and yeah, like I said, comments below if you missed it and you come in later. I'll try to answer any questions you have. But yeah, thank you everyone, appreciate it. Thank you, Steve,
of
really
course.
appreciate it. It's been a blast. So
Yep. Thanks for everyone for watching. We'll see you next time at the guild. Bye bye.
have a good weekend, everyone. Bye bye.